It is a little after 6 in the evening on the 28th of October, 1991, and a sword fishing boat is on the radio, calling another boat she has fished beside all season. She is the Andrea Gail, 72 feet of steel, out of Gloucester, Massachusetts, and she is a long way from home. She is off the Grand Banks, about 160 miles east of Sable Island, running for port with a full hold. On the other end of the call is Linda Greenlaw, captain of the Hannah Bowden, a boat from the same owner's fleet. The two skippers trade positions and weather, the way crews working the same water keep an eye on one another. The Andrea Gail reports 30-foot seas, wind gusting toward 80 knots, and a storm still building around her. That is the last anyone hears from her. No distress call is ever received. No flare, no beacon, no voice on the radio. When the search is finally over, the sea has given back an emergency beacon washed up on a beach and some scattered deck gear. The boat herself and the 6 men aboard are never found. More than 30 years later, how and when the Andrea Gail was lost is still not known, and it is very likely never going to be. There was no distress call, so nobody knows the hour she got into trouble. There were no survivors, so nobody aboard can say what happened. The boat was never found, so there is no wreck to read. This file is going to be careful about that, because a great deal has been written and filmed about the last hours of this boat, and almost none of it is in the record. What follows is what the record holds, and where it stops. It begins with the thing that was assembling itself around her while she made that call. What was building was a collision of weather systems that meteorologists would study for years afterward. In the last days of October, a strong area of high pressure sat over eastern Canada. Along its edge, a cold front pushed off the coast and spun up a low-pressure system, an ordinary autumn nor'easter, over the water east of Nova Scotia. Nothing about that is unusual. The North Atlantic manufactures these systems every autumn, and every boat on the banks expects to work through several a season. That low deepened quickly. Then it did something rare. Far to the south, Hurricane Grace was tracking north through the Atlantic. Grace was a real hurricane in her own right, and under ordinary conditions she would have curved out to sea and weakened, as most late-season Atlantic hurricanes do. Instead, the new low reached south and took her. As the nor'easter strengthened, it drew Grace into itself, pulling the hurricane's warm, wet, energetic air into its own circulation. By the 30th of October, it had absorbed her completely. What remained was a single system of extraordinary power. It had 3 things working for it at once, and that combination is why it is still taught. It was fed by tropical heat, carried north inside it from a hurricane. It was driven by the sharp clash of cold Canadian air against that warmth, which is the engine that deepens any nor'easter. And it was penned in place by the high pressure over Canada, which would not let it move away out to sea in the ordinary way. A storm that cannot travel stands still and works the same water over and over, and that is how the sea state got where it got. The numbers it produced were among the largest ever recorded in those waters. Its central pressure fell to about 972 millibars, the mark of a severe storm. A weather buoy on the Scotian Shelf, south of Halifax, measured a wave just over 100 feet high, the tallest ever recorded there. Another buoy logged its seas rising more than 70 feet in 10 hours. That last figure is the one that describes what it was like to be out there. 70 feet in 10 hours means the ocean around a boat became a different ocean over the course of a single watch. A crew that went to bed in a bad gale woke in something without precedent in their working lives. The people who studied it afterward reached for a way to describe how neatly every ingredient had lined up, and a National Weather Service meteorologist called it, in conversation, a perfect storm. The name stuck and it has since done a certain amount of damage because it makes the thing sound designed. It was not designed. It was 3 ordinary features of an autumn Atlantic arriving in an unlucky order. It is worth following the system to its end because it explains why this storm is documented as thoroughly as it is. It did not confine itself to the fishing grounds. Driven west against the coast by the same block that penned it, it ran an enormous swell onto the eastern seaboard for days. Coastal Massachusetts and Maine took serious damage, hundreds of homes were wrecked or undermined, and the property loss ran to something on the order of $200 million. The summer home of the sitting President of the United States at Kennebunkport in Maine was among the buildings damaged, which is one reason the storm was on every front page in the country for a week. The final count of the dead came to about 13 people, and 6 of them were the crew of the Andrea Gail. And then the system did one last unusual thing. Having spent days as a nor'easter, it moved south and east over warmer water, reorganized, and briefly developed a warm core and an eye of its own. In post-analysis, the National Hurricane Center recognized it as a hurricane, which it remained for a short time before turning north again and coming ashore over Nova Scotia. It was never given a name because naming it after the fact would have caused more confusion than it resolved. So the storm that took her began as an ordinary autumn low, ate a hurricane, and ended as one. That is the whole meteorological life of the thing in a sentence, and there is no comparable case in the modern record of that coast. Here is where the Andrea Gail was, as closely as the record can place her. On the 28th of October, she is running west and south for home, off the Grand Banks, roughly 160 miles from Sable Island, with the system building fast around her. A little after 6 that evening, she reaches the Hannah Bowden by radio and gives her position, her sea height, and her wind. After that call, there is nothing. No further transmission is logged. No distress signal reaches any station. The storm climbs to its peak over the following 2 days, and the Andrea Gail is somewhere inside it, and the record cannot say where or what she met, or at what hour. The question that follows is why a 72-foot boat was out there at all, that late in the year, and the answer is arithmetic rather than recklessness. The Andrea Gail was built in 1977 at a yard in Panama City, Florida, and finished the following year. 72 feet long, rated at about 92 tons, a steel-hulled commercial fishing boat of a common East Coast kind. She had been built for the trade she died in, and she had worked it for more than a decade without trouble. By 1991, she was owned by a Gloucester man named Robert Brown and worked out of Gloucester Harbour. Almost no clear photograph of her survives, and none that we can show. The boats you see in this account are her sisters, from the same fleet and the same trade, labelled where they appear. She was a swordboat. She fished with what the trade calls a long line, a single main line paid out for miles behind the boat, carrying hundreds of baited hooks on shorter branch lines, held near the surface by floats and left to soak. The line goes out at dusk and comes back at dawn, and what comes back with it is broadbill swordfish, a fish that can run to several hundred pounds, and that was worth, in 1991, more per pound than almost anything else landed on that coast. A swordboat is a small factory. She steams out to the grounds, sets her gear, hauls it back, dresses and ices the catch below, and does it again for weeks until the hold is full or the trip runs out of time. The work runs around the clock in shifts, in the open, on a wet steel deck, with a mile of monofilament and several hundred baited hooks moving past a man's hands. The grounds she worked were the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, and farther out, the Flemish Cap, a rise in the seabed a few hundred miles east of Newfoundland, past the edge of the continental shelf. It is about as far into the open Atlantic as a boat of her size goes to work. It is good fishing, and it is a long way from anywhere, beyond easy help, beyond the reach of a quick run home, and squarely in the track of the storms that cross the North Atlantic in autumn. It is a young fishery, in its industrial form. For most of its history, swordfish were taken with a harpoon, one fish at a time, by a man standing on a pulpit rigged out over the bow of a small boat, and the catch was correspondingly small. Long lining changed the scale of it entirely from the 1960s onward, and by the 1980s, a rising export market, much of it for the Japanese table, had made a full hold worth a very large sum. That is the trade the Andrea Gail was built into. High value per pound, high capital cost, and long trips to distant grounds because the near ones had been worked. Now, the economics, which is the actual answer to the question. Gloucester had been a fishing port since 1623, one of the oldest in the country, and by 1991 it was a hard place to earn a living from the water. The groundfish stocks that had built the town were in serious decline, boats were being tied up, and sword fishing was one of the few trades left that could still pay a crew properly. The reason is worth being specific about. The cod, haddock, and flounder that had built Gloucester over 3 centuries were in steep decline by the late 1980s, fished down by a fleet that had been encouraged to grow through the 1970s and then had nowhere to go. Regulation followed, and closures followed the regulation, and a working port that had been built around groundfish found itself with too many boats chasing too few fish. Sword fishing was one of the few remaining trades where a boat could still cover her costs and pay a crew a real share, which is precisely why boats went so far out to do it, but it pays only on delivery. A sword boat earns nothing until her hold is full and the fish are sold. The men do not draw a wage, they fish for a share of what the trip makes, so a poor trip pays poorly and a poor season pays worse, and every man aboard has a direct financial interest in staying out until the hold is full. That is the structure of the entire industry, and it is the mechanism that puts small boats in bad places at bad times of year. Nobody has to order it, the share system does it. That autumn the fishing had not been good. When the fish are not on the near grounds, a captain who means to make the trip pay goes farther and stays later and pushes the calendar toward the edge of the weather. The Andrea Gail went east to the Cap, and she stayed into the last week of October. By late in the month, she had her fish, and then a second clock started. Accounts of the trip hold that her ice machine failed, which, for a boat with a hold full of swordfish, is a hard deadline rather than an inconvenience. Iced fish keeps only so long, and a full hold with failing refrigeration is a cargo losing value by the hour. Whether or not that was the deciding factor, the general shape is not in dispute. She had her catch, she was a long way out, and she turned for Gloucester with close to 1,000 miles of open ocean between her and the harbour into weather that was already changing. 6 men left Gloucester aboard her on the 20th of September 1991. Her captain was Frank William Tyne, known to everyone as Billy. He was in his late 30s, and he had not come to fishing young. He had worked ashore first and gone to sea later, and he had made himself good at it, working up to command and running boats in Bob Brown's fleet. He had a reputation as a highliner, which in that trade means a captain who finds fish when others do not, and it is the only reputation that matters. With him were 5 crew: Robert Shatford, called Bobby, a Gloucester man from a Gloucester family; David Sullivan, known as Sully; Michael Moran, known as Bugsy; Dale Murphy, called Murph; and Alfred Pierre. Some were Gloucester-born, others had come north for the season and the share of a good trip, which is how crews on that coast have always been assembled. Accounts of the men and their last days ashore rest almost entirely on one book and on interviews given to it, and this file will not reconstruct their conversations or their states of mind. What can be said without inventing anything is what the town itself was. A working port where the fleet, the bars, the chandlers and the families were the same few streets, where a crew signed on days before sailing, and where the loss of a boat took 6 men out of a small number of connected households at once. The number matters here in a way it does not in a liner disaster. 6 is small enough that a town feels it individually, and Gloucester had felt it many times. The memorial on the waterfront that this episode ends at carries names from 3.5 centuries of the same trade, and the town's own count of its losses runs into the thousands. The Andrea Gail was not an aberration in Gloucester. She was the most famous instance of an ordinary risk. Fishing has long been, by the numbers, the most dangerous work in the United States, with a death rate many times that of an average occupation. The reason is structural rather than dramatic. It puts heavy machinery, cold water, long hours, small crews and weather that nobody can call off all in the same place, and then it pays by the catch rather than the hour. Because the Andrea Gail left no record of her last hours, the only honest way to describe what she was in is to describe what the same storm did to vessels that came back and filed reports. That evidence is extensive, and it is documented, and it belongs here. Start with the boat she had been talking to. The Hannah Bowden, a larger vessel from the same fleet under Linda Greenlaw, was working the same general area and came through it. She was bigger, and she was farther from the worst of it, and both of those things mattered. Other Gloucester boats were out in it and survived, including the Mary T., whose crew rode out the storm and later gave accounts of the sea state to the inquiry and the press. Then there was the sailing yacht Satori, a 32-foot boat with 3 people aboard, caught out in the same system well to the south. Her crew was taken off by the Coast Guard in conditions at the outer limit of what a rescue swimmer can work in. The Satori herself was abandoned and, in a detail the sea seems to enjoy, later washed up largely intact. And there was the Japanese vessel Aishin Maru, whose master was badly injured aboard and had to be taken off by a Canadian rescue effort in the middle of it. The boat on the other end of her last radio call has her own place in the record. Linda Greenlaw was one of very few women commanding a swordboat on that coast, and she was a highliner in the same sense Teeny was. She brought the Hannah Bowden home through the same system, and she has since written about the trade at length, which makes her one of the few people who both worked those grounds in that decade and left a first-hand account of the work itself. Her testimony about the last radio contact is the reason the Andrea Gail's final position and sea state are known at all. The most instructive case is the one where the rescue system itself failed. On the 30th of October, an Air National Guard helicopter out of Long Island was working the storm on a rescue tasking. Attempting to take on fuel from a tanker aircraft in those conditions, it could not complete the refueling, ran its tanks down, and ditched into the sea at night in the worst of the weather. 4 of the 5 men aboard were recovered. A para-rescue man named Rick Smith was not, and he was never found. That event is the measure of the storm, and it is why it belongs in this file. The aircraft that ditched was a purpose-built rescue platform, crewed by professionals whose entire job is operating in weather that has already defeated somebody else, flying with tanker support. The storm took it anyway, and it kept one of them, exactly as it kept the 6 men on the Andrea Gail, and for the same reason, past a certain sea state and wind speed, the margin that equipment and skill normally provide simply is not there. The men who went into the water from that aircraft were recovered by a surface vessel in seas that no small boat could have launched into, and the para-rescue man who was lost was afterward honored by his wing and named on its memorials. The rescue services treat that night as a reference point, and the case is still used in training because it is the clearest available demonstration of a limit, the point past which the equipment and the people who go and get others cannot themselves be gone and got. The Coast Guard cutter Tamaroa worked through that night and pulled men out of the water, both from the yacht earlier and from the ditched helicopter afterward. Her crew's accounts of the conditions are part of the public record of the storm, and they are the closest thing that exists to testimony from inside it. The Tamaroa had history behind her for that night. She had been built as a fleet tug for the United States Navy in the Second World War, served as the Zuni, and worked at Iwo Jima before being transferred to the Coast Guard and spending decades on rescue work out of the Northeast. She was almost 50 years old in 1991, and she was in seas that were sinking newer and larger vessels, and she stayed on station and got people out of the water. None of this tells us what happened to the Andrea Gail. All of it tells us what she was in. This is the part where a documentary usually explains the sinking. This one cannot. And it is worth being plain about why and about what fills the gap when a file stays open. There was no distress call, so nobody knows the hour she got into trouble. There were no survivors, so nobody aboard can say what happened. The boat herself was never found, so there is no wreck to read and no evidence on the seabed to weigh. Any reconstruction would have to begin from a blank. A book and later a film told the story of the Andrea Gail and made her crew known to millions of people. Both imagined the boat's final hours in close detail, as drama does. The record contains none of those hours. Some of the families were unhappy with what was written and shown, which is a reasonable thing to note and then leave alone. That version is acknowledged here and set to one side. What can be said honestly is narrower, and it is still worth saying. A boat of 72 feet was in open ocean in a system that raised seas of 100 feet not far away. It is worth holding those two numbers next to each other. 100-foot sea is not a bigger version of the weather a boat like that works in. It is a different category of event, taller than the vessel is long, and no seamanship makes a boat that size survivable in the breaking face of one. There is a point about wave measurement here that matters because the 100-foot figure is often misread. When oceanographers describe a sea state, they normally give significant wave height, which is roughly the average of the largest third of the waves present. Individual waves in that same sea routinely run much higher, and the largest can approach twice the significant height. So, a 100-foot wave does not mean the ocean was uniformly 100 feet high. It means the sea state was severe enough that a wave of that size existed within it, and that anything working in that water would meet waves of every size up to it. For a vessel, the individual wave is the one that counts. A boat can ride a very large swell all day if it passes under her with a long period between crests. What sinks boats is steepness and breaking, a wave whose face has grown too vertical to climb or whose crest is collapsing forward. A stalled storm working the same fetch for days produces exactly that, seas coming from more than one direction at once, crossing and reinforcing, with no orderly period to them. Beyond the wave heights, 3 general mechanisms are known to sink boats of her type in that weather, and the record supports naming them as possibilities without choosing between them. A boat can be rolled by a breaking sea onto her beam and past it, and if water gets below through a hatch or a door, she does not come back. A boat running before a very steep following sea can be driven bow down into the back of the wave ahead and pitchpole, going over end for end, and a boat can be progressively swamped, taking water aboard faster than she clears it, until she loses the freeboard that keeps her floating. There is also cold and spray of the kind that builds ice on a hull and takes away its stability, though late October in that latitude makes that a lesser factor than it would be in January. She was also working late in a poor season, far out on the Cap. which is to say she was where the arithmetic of the trade had sent her, in the worst place to be when the weather turned. Beyond those facts, any account of one particular wave at one particular moment is a guess, and this file does not guess. On the 6th of November, a patrol on Sable Island found her emergency beacon washed ashore. In the days after, some of her deck gear and a fuel drum came up in the same waters. Nothing else was ever recovered. One piece of equipment was meant to speak for her, and it is the detail that stays with the record. The rule required that a vessel be able to mark her position when she is in trouble, so that searchers know where to look. Aboard the Andrea Gail, the beacon marked nothing. She carried an EPIRB, an emergency position indicating radio beacon, a self-contained transmitter designed to send a signal that satellites and aircraft can home in on. No signal was ever received from it. When it came ashore on Sable Island, it had not transmitted. It has often been said that its switch was found turned off. The Canadian Coast Guard could not confirm that with certainty, and this file will not assert it. What is certain is the outcome. The one device aboard built to call for help said nothing, and so the search began without the single fact it most needed, which was where she was. That absence shaped everything that followed. A search with a beacon position starts as a small circle and expands. A search without one starts with a last known position from a radio call, adds every direction she might have traveled, adds the set of the current and the drift of the wind over days, and becomes enormous almost immediately. It is worth stating how a search of that kind is actually built, because the size of the number is a consequence of method rather than of effort. A search planner begins with a datum, the best estimate of where the vessel was when she was lost. With a beacon, the datum is a position and a time, accurate to within a small radius. Without one, the datum here was a radio call from the evening of the 28th, and everything after it had to be modeled. How far she might have run before she was lost, in what direction, and then how far wreckage or a raft would have drifted under the set of the current and the push of the wind over the following week. Each of those unknowns multiplies the area. A search area is not drawn around a boat. It is drawn around an accumulating uncertainty, and it grows with every hour that passes. The coast guards of two countries searched regardless. Over about 10 days, they covered more than 180,000 square nautical miles of the North Atlantic, an area larger than many countries, flying and steaming through the long tail of the same storm that had caused it. Aircraft flew search patterns. Surface vessels worked the drift lines. What came back was a short list, and it is the entire physical record of the Andrea Gail, the emergency beacon from the Sable Island beach, a fuel drum, some propane tanks, a length of her radio antenna, and pieces of deck gear that could be identified as hers. Objects that float, in other words, and nothing that indicates how she was lost. There was no oil slick reported, no raft, no debris field of the kind a breakup sometimes leaves, and no wreckage that showed damage anyone could read. They found the beacon and the drifting gear, and no more. On the 9th of November, the search was suspended, and the 6 men were formally recorded as lost. A suspension is not a conclusion. It is a decision that the probability of finding anyone alive has fallen below the point that justifies keeping aircraft and cutters in the air and on the water, and it is reviewed rather than closed. Nothing has since reopened it. In the trade, that is the ordinary ending. Boats that go down in deep water far from land are usually not found, and the men are usually not recovered, and the families are left with a suspension notice rather than a funeral. An open cause does not mean nothing was learned. The Coast Guard held a Marine Board inquiry into the loss, and it could reach no finding on cause for the reasons already stated. What it could examine was the vessel's condition, her certification, her stability, and the equipment she carried, and it is that part of the record that has practical value. The procedural baseline is worth stating plainly because it surprises people. A commercial fishing vessel of her size in 1991 was an uninspected vessel under United States law. A passenger steamer carrying the same number of people would have been surveyed on a schedule, issued a certificate, and held to a documented stability standard. A fishing boat was not. There was no requirement for a stability letter, no periodic hull survey by the Coast Guard, and no certificate to lose. The industry ran on the owner's judgment and the captain's, and the law's involvement began, in practice, after something had happened. There was also litigation afterward, brought by family members against the vessel's owner over the boat's condition and seaworthiness, which is a matter of public court record and which this file notes without relitigating. The loss fell in the middle of a long argument about how dangerous commercial fishing is allowed to be, and that argument was already producing law. A federal statute passed in 1988, the Commercial Fishing Industry Vessels Safety Act, phased in through the early 1990s, had begun to require commercial fishing vessels to carry survival gear that many had simply gone without. Immersion suits to keep a person alive in cold water for hours rather than minutes, life rafts sized for the whole crew, emergency beacons of the kind the Andrea Gail carried. That last requirement is where the Andrea Gail changed something, and the change is precise. A beacon that has to be switched on by hand is only as good as the last few seconds aboard a sinking boat, and those are the seconds least likely to be available. What the industry moved toward instead over the following years was the float-free beacon, a unit mounted in a bracket that releases when the vessel goes under, floats up on its own, and begins transmitting without anyone touching it. No hand is needed, and no switch can be left off. The beacons themselves changed in a second way, which is worth a plain word because it is the more consequential of the two. The units of that generation broadcast on an analog aviation distress frequency, 121.5 megahertz. That signal carried no identifying information, so a satellite pass could tell a rescue center that something somewhere was transmitting and give a position accurate only to a wide area. It also produced false alarms in enormous numbers from equipment faults and accidental activations, which meant a genuine signal arrived among a great deal of noise. What replaced it was a digital beacon on 406 megahertz, working through the international COSPA-SARSAT satellite system, carrying a coded identity unique to the vessel it is registered to and giving a far tighter position. A rescue center receiving one of those knows which boat is calling and roughly where she is, within minutes. The older frequency was eventually retired from satellite processing altogether. A boat lost today in the Andrea Gail's position, with a float-free 406 beacon aboard, would be a known casualty at a known place within the hour. Forecasting changed as well. The 1991 storm became one of the most studied weather events on the East Coast. The models and the buoy network that watched that stretch of ocean were improved in the years that followed, and the specific failure mode of that system, a nor'easter capturing a tropical cyclone and then stalling under a block, is now something forecasters actively look for. A system assembling that way would be seen coming with considerably more warning today. None of it reaches back to the 28th of October, 1991. The men on the Andrea Gail fished under the rules, the gear and the forecasts of their own time. What followed was written so the next crew would have a better chance of being found. On the Gloucester waterfront, there is a bronze statue of a fisherman at a ship's wheel, leaning into weather, looking out to sea. It was raised in 1923 for the town's 300th year, and it carries a line from the Book of Psalms, "They that go down to the sea in ships Near it are plaques that hold the names of the Gloucester men lost to the sea across the centuries, a list the town has kept since its earliest days and has had to keep adding to. In the autumn of 1991, 6 names were added to it. Frank William Tyne, called Billy the captain, Robert Shatford, David Sullivan, Michael Moran, Dale Murphy, Alfred Pierre. 6 men who left Gloucester on a 72-foot boat on the 20th of September and did not come back, and whose last word to the world was a position, a sea height, and a wind, spoken over the radio to a friend on another boat into a storm that was still getting worse. Gloucester reads those names. The town holds a memorial service for its lost fishermen, and the list is spoken aloud, and it has been spoken aloud for long enough that the 6 from 1991 are now read alongside men lost a century and more before them. That is the form remembrance takes in a fishing port. A list that somebody is still responsible for reading. The Andrea Gail is out there still, somewhere on the floor of the North Atlantic, in a place no survey has ever fixed. The record of her loss stays open, as it has to, because the sea kept every answer. The port of Hull, in England, lost 3 trawlers in a single winter in 1968, and the safety rules that followed came out of the same argument this loss reopened about how dangerous fishing is allowed to be. That investigation is the companion to this one.